I never know how to start these videos. Welcome back to the Data Protection Diaries and welcome back to another video. Thank you very much for taking some time out of your day to join us. Today we are talking about the new, much more detailed guidance that the ICO has released on dealing with subject access requests. Now, in particular, for this video, we're only going to focus on the three things that were mainly called out during the consultation period. We understand about 350 people went back on the consultation, which for an ICO consultation is actually pretty impressive. But the three main things were when you can stop the clock, from when you've got a request, when you can stop the clock and pause it. What is manifestly excessive? So when can you reject a request based on the fact that it's manifestly excessive? And also in relation to fees, when can you charge a fee and what can that fee actually be made up of? So they were the three main things that we're going to concentrate on today. If you find this video useful, if you find it interesting, if you're new to the channel, all of those things, please do make sure that you subscribe to the channel. Hit the little notification bell as well and you'll be told or informed when we upload a video. We're generally doing about one a week at the minute. And obviously hit that like button as well. All of these things just really help us to get YouTube to understand that people like these videos, and then we can show them to more people and more people are interested, and it goes on. This is the way things work. Anyway, enough of that sort of rabble. Let's get on with today's video. The ICO has released some more updated and much more detailed guidance around dealing with a subject access request. Obviously, a subject access request is a right of an individual to request a copy of the information that an organization holds about them, or a copy of the personal data that an organization holds about them, and also the right to understand why they have it, what they're processing it for. If you're watching this, you're probably already aware of what a subject access request is. So I'm going to point out at this stage that I'm not going through the guidance in any kind of detail because it is 81 pages long and that's not what we're here to do. If you are looking for particular training on subject access requests, I can highly recommend Tim Turner from 2040 Training. There's no kind of sponsorship on this video, but he is one of the best trainers in the business from my perspective. I'll put his details down below, but we're just going to concentrate on the three main changes that have been issued or clarified in the new guidance. Change number one, stop the clock. Possibly one of the most widely debated things that always comes across when dealing with a SAR is at what point can an organization actually stop the clock? So from the time that you receive a request to the time that you're providing the information to the requester, you actually have a period of 1 calendar month. So you have 1 month from when you receive the request from within which to provide the information. But there's always been a lot of debate around how that works. Are there opportunities to stop the clock? Essentially, when you're looking for clarifications, when you're looking for more information, or when you haven't had enough information through from the requester. This has been something that's been debated back and forth for a long time, and the ICO have now clarified this in particular throughout the guidance that they have just issued. So the main areas that we can find within the guidance that talk about stopping the clock relate to, firstly, requesting and receiving proportionate ID from the requester. Now, the key thing here is that the ID has to be proportionate to the request. So if somebody is requesting access to not particularly sensitive information, let's say they're a service user of a utility company, for instance, then the level of ID required is going to be much less than somebody requesting access to social and healthcare records, something that's much more detailed and potentially could create much greater harm. So you have to look at whether the ID you're asking for is proportionate and is it fair? Do you really need to ask for a passport, driving license, etc.? But you can stop the time clock on the request while you are waiting for that identification to come in. as long as you have asked for identification at the beginning. So when you receive the request, you haven't waited 2 or 3 weeks down the line. So that's the first thing. Next time that you can stop the clock is if you are dealing with a large, manifestly excessive request. Now we'll talk about what is classed as manifestly excessive shortly, but you are allowed to stop the clock to ask for clarification. This doesn't mean that somebody who has said, I want to know everything you hold about me, that doesn't mean that you can stop. But if they've worked with you, let's say they're an employee and they've worked with you for 20 years, they're asking for everything, you can ask for clarification around dates, times, the types of information or the types of interactions that the information may have been involved in, and you are permitted to stop the clock while you wait for that information and that clarification to be provided. Now, this is really, really important when you're dealing with a huge or potentially large volume or excessive request whereby you hold a lot of information about an individual, and it actually gives you the opportunity to nail that down, try and find specifically or targeted areas that are going to enable your search to be much more efficient, and is actually going to yield better results for the requester as well. The third change that seems to have come out in the guidance is around clarifying whether or not a specific individual has actually made a request. Now, we've seen a large rise in a number of requests being issued by third parties. So being issued by solicitors on individuals' behalf or issued by other non-profit organisations purporting to be acting on the behalf of the specific individual whose information is being asked for. Clarification in the guidance now states that you are permitted to stop the clock while you make certain that the information about the individual is being requested by the individual or on their behalf. Now, what they are saying is that actually that means you should be contacting the individual immediately or as quickly as possible, either by email or by phone, to clarify that they are happy for the information to be provided and happy for somebody else to be acting on their behalf. Again, it's really important that you don't just leave this until you're 2 weeks in thinking that it's going to get you extra time, but it does stop the clock from the point that you have made contact and you are waiting for them to respond to you. The second major clarification in the new guidance brings more information around what is actually classed as a manifestly excessive request and what does manifestly exactly mean. Now, I've got a copy of this in front of me, so if my eyes go off, just apologise for that, but it's important that I get this right. So the ICO guidance now states that to determine whether a request is manifestly excessive, you need to consider whether it is clearly or obviously unreasonable. You should base this on whether the request is proportionate when balanced with the burden or costs involved in dealing with the request. This will mean taking into account all the circumstances of the request, including the nature of the information requested, the context of the request and the relationship between you and the individual, whether a refusal to provide the information or even acknowledge it you may hold may cause substantive damage to the individual, whether you've got the available resources to even deal with the request, which has been a massive challenge, obviously, during the latest crisis, whether the request largely repeats itself in previous requests, and whether it overlaps with other requests. For me, to be honest, it doesn't really give the clarification that I think they think that it does. I don't think it's really giving any particular insight into what could be classed as manifestly excessive, but it does kind of give us something to work with. What's important here is that if you are going to try and determine a request as being manifestly excessive, so let's say you've got a huge amount of data about a specific individual, let's say an employee, a lot of that information is stored in archives. It's going to be incredibly costly for you to retrieve that information, and actually the benefit of retrieving that information to the individual is going to be very low because they worked in the organization and they know what information was processed about them, then maybe that's something that you could possibly argue as being manifestly excessive. Personally, I would like to see some much more clear examples about what this means and how this is going to affect businesses, because I think this is still going to be a huge challenge, but there is more information in the guidance if you want to go out there and really get into it. The third thing that the guidance finally provides clarity on is fees. Now, many of you will be aware that there is not a regular fee anymore for requesting a subject access request. Back in the old days, those of you who remember the 98 Act will know that you could charge a standard £10 fee for having access to information. And you could charge up to £50 for records that were created manually, very often healthcare records. So things that needed printing off specific machines or off specific tapes or pulling out of certain types of archives. Now, under the GDPR, that was removed. So information should be made freely available. But that doesn't mean that when you're dealing with a large or manifestly excessive request, as we've just talked about, that you can't charge a fee for admin purposes, for paper, for photocopying, for delivery, for equipment such as CDs, USB drives that the information needs to be put on. But more importantly, you can charge a fee for the amount of time that it takes for your employees or your staff to actually deal with the request. Again, this is something that has been long debated. What is an appropriate admin fee? You know, if you work in an organisation where the hourly wage is £6.50 an hour, then the proportionate fee is £6.50 an hour, surely, for your staff's time. But if you work in a magic circle lawyer's office, you know, potentially the admin fee could be hundreds of pounds. Somebody could be on hundreds of pounds an hour to manage this information. So where does it become appropriate? Where is that level of cost determined? What the guidance here hasn't done is provide any kind of listing, any kind of detailed guidance around that. What it has said is that you are allowed to charge a proportionate fee based on your staff's hourly rate. And obviously that is going to be massively different from organisation to organisation. What you should do though is have a predetermined cost list, essentially. So what would it usually cost for you to carry out photocopying? How much does an A4 sheet of paper cost? How much does postage cost? How much does a CD cost, a USB drive cost? And how much roughly is a reasonably proportionate hourly rate for your employees that are dealing with any large or manifestly excessive requests? Now, that information doesn't have to be provided publicly, but it should be made available to the requester should they wish to see it. It should also be made available to the ICO should they come and ask you to determine whether or not you are charging an appropriate level of admin fee. So that is something to think about, but it is going to vary wildly depending on organisation, depending on the business, and depending on, quite simply, how much you pay people to do the work that you pay them to do. For me, I think what we've ended up with is 81 pages of information and detail that doesn't necessarily answer the questions that everybody wanted it to answer, but it has given us more ground to play with. It's given us more scope, more grey area, which, if you're a lawyer, is always useful. And if you're good at arguing things from a risk-based perspective, is always useful. Because all of this stuff is about interpretation, it's about documentation, it's about showing your working out and showing your decision making. I think it's going to be really interesting to see how this plays out moving forward and how it plays out in terms of enforcement and regulation. But for now, we're just going to have to wait and see. As always, this is a fairly succinct view of the world. This guidance is 81 pages long, and there are a lot of other changes in there that we're not going to go into in great detail in this video. As I said at the beginning, if you're looking for specific training on subject access subject access requests, I can highly recommend Tim Turner from 2040 Training. I'll put his details down below. He is not affiliated with us. He's not affiliated with our organization, but he is one of the best trainers out there. If you have any questions, please do put those down below, and obviously subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and we look forward to speaking to you again soon. Thanks very much.